Linguistic Colloquium of the Department of Theoretical and Applied Linguistics. And Andrei Kibrik will introduce our today's speaker. Andrei?
Да, спасибо. Доклад Алана Cienki будет сегодня на английском языке, но он прекрасно говорит по-русски и понимает тоже, поэтому я произнесу свои вступительные слова на этом общепонятном языке. Алан Cienki – это американско-нидерландско-российский лингвист. Он учился в университете Брауна, затем длительное время с 1989 года по 2006 работал в университете Эмори в Атланте, а с 2006 года уже живет и работает в Нидерландах, в Амстердаме, работает в свободном университете Амстердама. И кроме того, с 2013 года он также и стал московским лингвистом, хотя у него и до этого были тесные связи с российской лингвистикой, но он уже официально работает и является руководителем лаборатории, которая называется Multimodal Communication and Cognition Laboratory в лингвистическом университете. У Алана Cienki есть своя совершенно оригинальная и уникальная исследовательская программа, и он соединил два направления исследований, которые до него, мне кажется, очень мало объединялись, а именно когнитивную лингвистику, когнитивную семантику, как они сформировались, начиная с 90-х годов, и исследования сопровождающих речь жестов. Тоже примерно с того же времени или чуть более раннего времени существовавшее направление. Они развивались параллельно, и вот Алану Cienki пришла в голову замечательная идея эти две области, эти две традиции соединить, и вот они очень плодотворно соединяются в его исследованиях, а также уже вслед за ним в многочисленных исследованиях его коллег и учеников. Направление интересов Алана, которые он сам обозначил на сайте университета Амстердама, это когнитивная лингвистика, семантика и концептуализация, жестовые исследования, мультимодальная коммуникация, грамматика устной речи, исследование метафоры и сравнительное языкознание. У Алана есть огромное количество публикаций, книг, статей, но я назову только выборочно несколько последних, потому что если бы я перечислял все, то я бы занял слишком много его времени. В 2018 году вышла книга под редакцией Cienki и Ольги Ересхановой «Аспектуальность в кросс-языковой перспективе. Понимание событий в речи и в жесте». В предыдущем году, в 2017, вышла другая очень интересная работа «10 лекций об устной речи и жесте с позиции когнитивной лингвистики». Эта книга была издана в издательстве «Бриль». А еще за несколько лет раньше вышла очень фундаментальная работа, двухтомная энциклопедия «Тело, язык, коммуникация. Международный хендбук по мультимодальности в человеческом взаимодействии». Это буквально грандиозное издание, включает более 2000 страниц, и там описаны все возможные аспекты человеческой коммуникации. Это буквально справочник, которым можно пользоваться и искать там информацию по любому вопросу, связанному с естественной коммуникацией. И там Алан является одним из редакторов наряду с Мюллер и несколькими другими коллегами. Также хочу сказать, что у Алана Cienki есть целый ряд публикаций на русском языке. Некоторые из них были переведены, в других случаях это были оригинальные работы, написанные для отечественных изданий, в том числе последняя, кажется, из них, это в 2015 году в книге «Язык и мысль» статья «Понятие динамического диапазона коммуникативных действий в теории когнитивной лингвистики». Вот я думаю, что я вкратце охарактеризовал направление интересов нашего сегодняшнего докладчика. Я больше не буду занимать время. Пожалуйста, Алан, тебе слово.
Спасибо, Андрей, за приятные слова. И спасибо, Сергей, тоже за приглашение сегодня выступать с лекцией. Я буду говорить на английском языке, но если после этого будут вопросы, можно задавать вопросы на русском языке или на английском, как хотите. And the topic that I'm speaking about today, the question of language as multimodal or communication as very polysemiotic, is something I've been thinking about for a long time. And actually some aspects of this question, which I'll come back to, but I wanted to revisit the question today after having not thought about it for a little while, and see also what you think about this. This also refers to work that some of you have done also relating to multimodal communication. So I'm interested to also get your feedback and ideas. But I'll begin with a very basic point and a traditional view of language, a traditional view of levels of linguistic structure, thinking of phonemes, morphemes, syntactic structures. And the issue or fact, let's say, that these are often considered to be a category, what we think of as language, as a kind of circumscribed category. And this is what it deals with. Then issues or factors, properties, behaviors like having to do with intonation or gesture would then, according to many, fall outside of this category. But then that also puts it into the same category as laughing or coughing, clearing one's throat, things like that. The classic distinction that Chomsky made about competence and performance. So these all being different kinds of performance factors, perhaps. This then, some claim, is a view that applies to a given language, but also the idea of language in general. Let's say language with a big L. What is language? And as some would say, this reflects a kind of classical category structure. If you think of a category as a kind of box or as something with a border on it, and things can be in the category or outside the category. This is a traditional classical view of language then, of what counts as linguistic, and the rest being considered paralinguistic, so intonation and gesture, for example. This view, and some people have looked at this in a little more detail and said the distinction is actually even a bit deeper, because then in terms of what many consider to be linguistic, we can qualify those categories as ones that we can quantify in some way, that they have a categorical nature that can be then counted. The paralinguistic then has to do with properties that usually fall along a scale of some kind. So they're gradient in different ways. And you can think of different patterns of intonation or varying use of gesture, for example. But what I want to suggest is this is a problem. And others have also proposed this, a problematic view of language or of human communication. And one alternative view can be found in the field of cognitive linguistics. It's not the only place with alternative views, but in this approach, then we can look at language as governed by general cognitive principles rather than by some kind of special purpose language module, and that knowledge of language then emerges from language use in different ways. So the theory of cognitive grammar that Linguistic has proposed and others have developed then looks at the words, the lexicon and grammar as consisting of a link between a phonological structure and a semantic structure. So a pairing of form and meaning, which is of course a traditional view going back at least to de Saussure's view of the sign and linguistic signs. And Linguistic elaborated on this a bit more, and I wanted to point out this interesting little graph he introduced in his 2008 book, where he then talks about the scale of schematicity. So if we think of prototypical words or lexical items and how they differ from grammatical forms. If we have grammatical forms like case markers on nouns, for example, that can point out different kinds of relations, but then can sometimes be expressed with prepositions, for example, in some languages. So this is a little more schematic, let's say, and then class description. So what constitutes nouns or verbs or adjectives, a more schematic kind of category then. And what he pointed out is that we often think of there being a kind of border between what counts as grammar, which has certain kinds of rules that it follows, and what counts as the lexicon. And so this border might also move a bit for different languages, actually. So in this view, the form and meaning associations are schematized in different ways. They become entrenched by language users and systematized. But what Lanneker and others point out is that this applies to varying degrees. So it's not a yes or no distinction. It's a matter of degree. How entrenched are these forms? How schematized are they? So if we take this view and look at it in more detail, we think about what kinds of form meaning associations are schematized or entrenched to different degrees, then we can think about not only the morphemes and lexemes, let's say the default prototypes of what we think of as linguistic forms, but also some other categories like non-lexical sounds, and I'll talk about those a bit more, intonation contours, gestures, and maybe others as well. So if we think about these other categories and what's going on with them, if we start with the non-lexical sounds, for example, if we think of, let's take American English as an example, if we have different forms of agreement where people might say, yeah, in different ways also, that we have a set of meanings that are being expressed, some kind of acknowledgement or agreement. But the variants in each group also vary, and they vary in terms of how fixed their meanings are as well. So some of these you might find in a dictionary, you might find yeah in a dictionary of English, but might not be, depending on how your dictionary is structured. Or if we consider other non-lexical sounds like, again, clearing your throat, even exhaling loudly, or the tongue click, that in different ways might become might be more likely to be considered an expression of some idea, and in other contexts is just some other kind of behavior that's not so systematized and schematized and entrenched as part of a language system. Some of these have more fixed form meaning correspondences then. So let's say the yeah or hum, and others less so. So if somebody just says and they're thinking, it's not necessarily clear if there's a meaning that's being expressed as opposed to them doing something in the interaction and maybe showing that they're thinking in some way. So that we can see a range of degrees to which these different forms can have a conventional status as a symbolic structure, let's say expressing some idea. If we go further down the list and look at intonation contours, of course, we have a whole set of various forms here, but they vary in the degrees in which the form and meaning correspondence is fixed or not. So if we take, again, some American English examples, if someone says, I don't know, there's a common way of saying that, I don't know. So you have a sort of low, high, medium variation in intonation. Or somebody disagreeing and saying, So they have a high, low pattern. And these are conventional to the degree that people can then just say, produce the intonation pattern and say, without any words. And that can be a response to those that are competent in the language and then take that as being equivalent to I don't know. So some of these can be quite conventional, but others might be more limited in terms of the context in which they can be used. So a kind of low to high range of can be some kind of expression of disbelief in some way. Maybe that goes with a word, or maybe it's just with a neutral sound. And then some are used with a much wider range of different contents. So simply, let's say in English, using a high kind of tone for new information in some way, lower for known information. These are really much more schematic kinds of patterns, as Pierre Humbert and Hirschberg have discussed, for example. So again, we see a range in the status that they have as conventional kinds of symbols. And if we go to gestures, we also see a similar kind of scale that we can think of. Actually, David McNeil picked up on Adam Kendon's work and referred to this as Kendon's continuum, kind of paraphrasing what Kendon said, of thinking of different kinds of gestures. This is an adaptation of that kind of continuum. But if we think about what are often called emblems, there we also have much more fixed forms of form and meaning relationship, going back to David Efron's work. Actually, he introduced this term, where we then have kind of fixed symbolic status of a gesture within a culture, a form that's used intentionally to express some meaning, and that's known by members of the culture as having a certain significance. So thinking of examples, classic thumbs up kind of example, things being good, carries across many different European cultures, but also some less common ones. So this form, something that was produced by a musician, Taylor Swift, in her concerts, maybe starting 10, 15 years ago, and it caught on. And people didn't used to do this 20 years ago, but now people are doing it in many different contexts. Even some may recognize it from more recent events being used in different contexts. So it's become more accepted as a kind of emblem. It's a recent emblem, but again, it's culture specific. You have to know what is being intended with this kind of symbol. Or something like this. This is a Dutch speed skater who was showing a kind of, hey, that's great kind of symbol when he won a race. But when I showed this once before to a Russian speaking audience, some of them started laughing or giggling because they said, oh, that means he smokes marijuana. And it was a surprise to me because I never heard that interpretation. There's a kind of extended meaning. So these are culturally specific kinds of forms. They don't all necessarily carry across different cultures, but they're quite fixed in terms of the form-meaning relationship. If we go further down the scale, we see recurrent gestures. This is a category that was introduced in work by Cornelia Miller and colleagues, and also Adam Kendon had talked about gesture families before. But here we have recurrent groups of forms that have a limit in terms of how varied, how much they can be varied, and a recurrent set of meanings that go with them. So just to take an example, Whoopi Goldberg here on a talk show telling somebody to wait a minute. So holding up the index finger can also be used for attention in different ways. I've noticed Russian speakers sometimes usually do it with the reversed hand position, some variations there. Or the palm up open hand gesture, which can be done in different ways to express a kind of group of meanings of what do you mean, what, kind of maybe dismissing responsibility, it's not me. So there are a number of meanings, but there's also a limit in terms of the range of possible meanings. So with each of these, we see a form and then kind of group of meanings that goes with it, some away gestures. This is with a study that was done with German conversational data, but actually applies to a number of other European languages and probably even beyond a European context. A number of negative gestures, dismissing gestures, shaking something off, but also things like a cyclic or cyclic gesture showing continuation in some way. And the form meaning associations for these are then, we can get a sense of what they mean, but the context also provides a good bit of the meaning. The ring gesture may be showing something about precision, sometimes called a precision grip, as if you're holding something small between your fingers. So these gestures are kind of intermediate, have an intermediate status on this continuum then. And then if we go to the further end, we have more idiosyncratic gestures, what Kendon refers to as gesticulation. That's his particular term for that, where the form is much more dependent on the context. So if we see something like this is an American comedian in one of his routines telling a story. And if you ask somebody, what is he talking about? It's rather difficult to say. Some would say maybe he's holding something, maybe something about this big, or it's hard to know. And it turns out here he was actually talking about two people. It was an older couple who'd been married for many years, and he said he could see the connection that they had between them. So once you have the speech context, then you see much more that, okay, maybe it's more of an iconic relation of these two parts relating to reflecting each other, kind of mirroring each other. So the context is much more playing a much bigger role in terms of determining the meaning that's being expressed here. So these more idiosyncratic gestures are much more designed in the moment. They're not conventionally linked to a particular meaning, but are really understood through the iconicity and through the verbal context. So we end up with this scale, again, of these different forms. And we can then go back to this original idea of what counts as linguistic according to many and what counts as paralinguistic, and see that we're stuck with a kind of dilemma here because we have these strict borders on what's one and what's the other. We start to see that these categories that were considered conventional and discrete actually are gradient in many ways. And maybe we need to think about this as a problem, and how can we think about this differently? So one approach that is familiar to many of you is that of thinking of discourse as multi-channel. So the work of Kibidik and Fyodorova and the group who did this project on language as is, and looked at different channels of communication. So this, in a way, then removes us from the language problem and takes us to the discourse level, takes us to a broader perspective. So many of the lexicogrammatical forms would then fit in the verbal channel, but then we have everything else that's going on with the head, with the eyes, with the face being expressed. And we also then have a distinction here in terms of modality. So then talking about, okay, what is being produced vocally, what is being produced kinetically or through the movement. So this provides one other solution to that. And it raises the question then, can we talk about multi-channel linguistics? And actually, if we go to the guidebook here that was written about this, I wanted to look at this quote for a minute. So the somewhat provocative name of the project suggests that language includes not only verbal structure, but also a broader range of channels, from prosody to gesture and eye gaze. And there is no fundamental boundary between these various communication channels. And so I'd actually like to come back to you all after the talk and see if you still adhere to this point of view, if you want to vary that at all, or if in the past few years, if you've changed your views on that, or if you really want to stick with that. The question that I have is about the use of the thinking of language and linguistic, and what is language and what is linguistic, as opposed to discourse, let's say, and how we want to think about that. So if we come back to this distinction, then that seems to be problematic. One question is, do we want to say it's all linguistic? Do we want to put a big circle around it all and say that this all falls into one category? And if we think of one, and so this is the question then, is this a solution then to think of this all as spoken language? If we just take spoken language for a moment, not think about written language or assigned languages, for example, what would this mean? So we have the question of modalities, and that was divided out there in the diagram that we had. But then we also have these different modes or codes, depending on what theoretical framework you're using, different forms of expression, and the question of whether they map onto channels or not. So that's another possible topic for a discussion. Or is it the same thing to talk about a channel of communication, the means of production, and the semiotic mode or code of expression? So David McNeil, the psychologist who really got many people going on gesture research, starting back from the actually in the mid-1980s, and then his 1992 book really got people started on this. He really takes the view that gesture is part of language. And so he says, though, that the word language is being used in two ways in his work. So he clarified this in his 2005 book more than in his 1992 book. And he spells out the different ways. So he says, first, he used language in a technical linguistic sense to refer to those static structures of language. And this is consisting of the grammar and the words. So I might have a problem with the static sense here, but that's a way of characterizing one sense of thinking about language. But he says the other way would be, and he also is playing with this in his work, to think of language in a non-technical way, he calls it a traditional way, to indicate what it is that we know when we say we know a language, or when someone uses a language or speaks a language. In this way, he says gesture is part of language. So he's trying to kind of work his way around the big category of what it is that people are doing when they're speaking and communicating versus the particular system of lexicogrammatical forms. But he uses the word language throughout the book, which then I think for many readers creates some confusion of what it is that he's dealing with. So if we take this issue of, if we say that, language is multimodal, that gesture is part of language, there are some issues that arise. For example, gesture is not always used by speakers, nor always seen by those who are looking at them. We can say attending to them in some way. Or the fact that speech, gesture, and other semiotic systems normally have different communicative statuses in relation to each other. So if we think of the spoken lexical and grammatical items as more independent as a semiotic system, and the gesture is a more dependent semiotic system. So again, some of the work by Kubik, Albert, and Molchanova, some empirical research on this, then illustrating the dependence of gesture for determining the meaning, the function in the context, the dependence on the spoken language. So they're not, by default, they're not equal in status normally. So one possible solution, what I want to think about for a while here, is if we think about spoken language as being always at least, let's say, duo-semiotic, having a lexical grammar and also intonation. And then these being variably part of what we can call a polysemiotic communicative system. So I want to dwell on this for a minute. So polysemiotic. So Jordan Zlatov's has been promoting this term, and I think it's a very useful one. Alia Morgenstern and others use a variation on a plurisemiotic. So it depends on whether you're using your Greek or Latin roots here. But this way of then looking at, okay, if we focus on semiotic systems, what does that buy us? What advantage does that give us in looking at this question? So if we look at what's the nature of the individual semiotic systems as elements of a larger polysemiotic system, we might go back also to research from early years in cognitive science, looking at categories themselves. So how do we think about these categories of these semiotic systems? If we think about the work of Eleanor Rosch, also influenced by Wittgenstein, and William Leboff's work, where in one of his studies back from the 1970s, he looked at words and how they were used and what he called the boundaries of words and their meanings. So giving participants in a study certain images and asking them, what would you call this? In English, they might say it's a cup. And then you give them different variations on this. And then the question is you start changing the ratio, the width to height ratio, at what point do people have trouble calling it a cup? So when they get to something like number 5, is that still a cup? It's maybe a bowl with a handle. And then you have things that are in between where there's some variation in terms of what people are calling it. And actually, this is what he found in terms of the responses, that by 4 and 5, they're much more likely to call it a bowl, and that their likelihood of calling it a cup is already going down. But then he did a variation on this where he said, okay, now I want you to think of the container that you see is filled with mashed potatoes and sitting on a dinner table. What do you call it? What is it? And then the results really changed because if we take, this is what we had before, this line, but now with the food in it, we see that people are much more likely to call it a bowl earlier than they were before. And their likelihood of calling it a cup also decreases sooner. So the context is changing. The border is shifting depending on the given context in which we're thinking about the object in question. So one of his points was that there's there are fringe areas on our conceptual categories, that our conceptual categories often have fuzzy boundaries where we might have clear exemplars of them. So you might say, this is clearly a cup. People don't have a problem with that. Without a handle, this is more clearly a bowl. But that then there are these provide kind of prototypes for thinking about the categories with then gradation in between in different ways. And what Rosh and others looked at in their research was how word meanings often work this way as well, that we have word meanings being thought of as prototype categories with peripheral instantiations. Other researchers looked at phoneme categories and also found a similar result, that then even phonemes, we can then see they have a gradient boundary, even though there are salient prototypes in terms of thinking of what constitutes a certain consonant or vowel phoneme. Grammatical structures have also been looked at this way in terms of constructions as prototype categories. And Bybee then talks about it this way. She said all types of units proposed by linguists show gradients in the sense that there is a lot of variation within the domain of the unit, different types of words, morphemes, syllables, and difficulty in deciding what the boundaries of the unit are, separating them. So also, Andrei Kibrik proposed this idea of focal structures, and with his permission, I'd like to use this slide to talk about that as a solution to the categorization problem of thinking of, on the one hand, we might have discrete categories in certain instances. It's clearer, it's one thing or the other. Continuous structures, where you can think of musical tones, like I think of playing a trombone, for example, we have a rising or falling tone that then gradually changes. But then in other cases, we have focal structures where you have a focal point determining a category or a kind of anchor point. And then certain elements that are more or less close to that. And then in some cases, you might have some that are outliers that are really further out. And then if you have something that's really in between, then you have a hybrid. But that in many cases you would associate with one or the other focal point to think about a category. So that provides a kind of solution to thinking about categories in a more complicated way. Or Östendahl had a paper back in 1979 where he was talking about prototype categories, and in a footnote presented this image and said, well, maybe we can think of categories this way, as a kind of star-like structure where there's a focus and then certain extensions where the concept of the category then can spread out a little bit. So this was really an early way of thinking about that. And I think that that's useful if we then think of lexicogrammar, let's say, as a semiotic system with a prototype center. We have our words, lexical items, grammatical forms that we're not going to doubt as being part of a given language. But there are fuzzy boundary areas. So we saw these non-lexical sounds, for example. Sometimes they're word-like, more or less. And that these then can overlap to different degrees, these different semiotic systems overlapping with each other. So let's say we have the wordless intonation contours, or maybe kind of a borderline area. Is that part of English? If someone says, oh, is that, does that count as an utterance for English? And this overlap works to varying degrees, and it also changes along different time scales and variably by context. And so here's where we get the greater complexity in how all of this works together. So it's something I've written about a bit in the past and continuing to think about. Maybe it's a way to characterize all communicative semiotic systems in different ways as having a relatively stable, schematized, entrenched center of form, meaning pairings, and others that are more peripheral to that are less entrenched and more not so clearly part of the system. So if we take this idea of lexical grammar as having a fuzzy boundary that overlaps with other semiotic systems in a variable fashion, we can try to illustrate this and think about how is that working? And if we think of different contexts, it appears to work in different ways. So if we go back to, let's say, relevance theory, Sperber and Wilson, one of the things they pointed out is that interaction involves people variably playing the roles of, or this is at least my interpretation of what they were saying, variably playing the roles of producer of utterances or communication and those attending to it. Actually, Herb Clark introduced this term attender rather than saying listener or addressee, or he was pointing out it's someone that's paying attention to the person who's trying to communicate. I think it's a useful term, or a useful role that people can play. We can variably make use of a smaller or larger scope of expressive behaviors in different contexts. And the person that is attending to the person communicating might also have a broader or more narrow kind of scope or focus that they're using in communication. And this relates to some work on attention, Todd Oakley's work on attentional analysis of meaning, where he talked about the distributed adjustable capacity of attention. So this widening or narrowing kind of zoom lens metaphor for how we focus on something in a more concentrated way or in a broader way, which depends on different factors, like how dense the environment is that we're looking at and perceiving, so kind of bottom-up factors, but also depends on the individual. So whether you have a lot of attention available or certain social factors, what's going on around you in a given context at the moment, kind of top-down factors. And also work on metaphor, actually, from Cornelia Miller and colleagues who were looking at how people foreground metaphor in different ways, how they might use different expressions or gestures with metaphor to foreground them, or use a greater size in the production of the metaphor, so visibility factors. And also we can see this in terms of the eye gaze of the speaker, if they're looking at their own gestures, or if the other person is looking at their gestures. So we can see this overlap and between the different kind of semiotic systems. And this is what I call this overlap area, the dynamic scope of relevant behavior. So what's relevant in the given context? What kind of scope of behaviors are people taking into consideration? So we might say in a given communicative context, there is this dynamic scope of relevant behaviors that might differ depending on whether you're playing the role of producer or the attender at the given moment. And the scope then has a focus and a periphery also. So we again see this kind of center periphery structure. And it's dynamic in the sense that sometimes we zoom in, other times we zoom out and take in more behaviors into consideration, but we also shift our focus in different ways depending on what's going on in the given context. Sometimes you might be focusing more on someone's gestures and other times not looking at them. So we can see in different contexts, we're using a different kind of focus and incorporating different systems. So if you're listening to the radio and not looking at someone, for example, then we're focusing on the words, the grammatical forms, other sounds that are being made, but not focusing on the gesture, or maybe not at all attending to that. Whereas in a context where you're trying to communicate through a glass wall, then you're obviously going to be using much more gesture. You can't hear the other person, so then these fall into the background. But in other contexts where you're really listening and looking attentively at someone, you might be trying to take it all into account and then have a broader scope of relevant behaviors that you're using. These also vary on different time scales, how the scope moves. So within a given usage event of communication, moment by moment, but also across time over the course of a conversation, our focus changes and the scope, the breadth of it changes, but also developmentally in terms of how children learning language pay attention to different aspects of behavior, and even in terms of our the elderly, in terms of their maybe loss of certain communicative behaviors or loss of hearing, might pay attention more to gestures and other things. And even in terms of evolution. So we can see, let's say phylogenetically, in terms of what early pre-Homo sapiens were doing, making sounds, moving forelimbs, and then eventually leading into a form of language, which is then more what we focus on if we're from, especially I think, a literate society that's one focusing on writing. So this might be a way to look at communicative semiotic behaviors in general, as having this kind of prototype and then peripheral structure, and the focus then shifting, expanding, contracting in different ways. So this proposal then is not that just anything goes and it's all a big mix. We can still see the lexical and grammatical forms as forming the kind of the center of gravity for face-to-face interaction. If you're a hearing, speaking person, or if you're a user of a sign language, then it's going to be different kinds of forms that form the center. And the more idiosyncratic types of gestures and the intonation that's more particular for given context might act as what have been called by some overlays on these other forms, on the normally dependent on the linguistic forms, which might be independently, the lexical grammatical forms might be able to independently be their own kinds of expressive forms. And so I think this overlap deserves greater attention, actually, by linguists in terms of how these different forms are working together. So to wrap this up, we see that with this kind of polysemiotic approach, any linguistic analysis will be more complex because we're then looking at syntax beyond linear structures. We're also then looking at simultaneous as well as sequential structures. So not looking at syntax as just order in a sequential way, but also simultaneously what's going on, of course, with intonation, but then also with gesture in terms of these expressions. I've tried to work out some of these ideas in what I call utterance construction grammar. Adam Kendon focused on utterance as the level. So maybe that's similar but different in some ways from discourse, but looking at a higher level rather than focusing on the purely linguistic level per se. And I think this also moves us then from the earlier decades ago, more mechanistic view of language, which was then assuming that computers provided the prototype for thinking of how language might work, to an approach that's more human in nature. If we think of it as a product of complex biological systems, we're also then thinking about complex dynamic systems here, that some of those ideas also can certainly be applied here, a product of human brains and bodies. So I think this would be more relevant for us in that sense, maybe even humanizing linguistics in a further sense. So just to acknowledge some sources, these ideas go back to many years ago, and I had a grant at the Netherlands Institute for Advanced Study. Started thinking of some of these, and more recently, it's coming into play again in the current project we have funded by the Russian Science Foundation at the Linguistic University, looking at simultaneous interpreters and what they are doing in terms of their gesture use and eye gaze while they're interpreting. Of course, it's a very special context for looking at communication, but there we also see some of the same patterns and behaviors playing out as you would find in a normal conversation. So it's interesting to compare those. I will then leave it at that, and we have time for questions as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alan. Thank you for your talk. Would you like to take questions, or would you like me to take care of that?
I don't know if you see people faster than I do, or what's the best way to do that, whether it's raising hands or...
They can raise hands. There can be questions coming to the chat. So the talk is open for questions, comments, discussion, and whatever other feedback you may want to give.
Or someone wants to speak. Andrei already has a question. Andrei, do you want to begin?
Yeah, thanks. Very interesting. And my question is about your work on aspect and gesture. Your previous grant, previous project in Moscow was focused on aspect. And my question is, if you compare aspectual concepts in the verbal structure and in gesture, do you think they are equally quantal and or gradient, or maybe the verbal aspect is more quantal compared to what we see in gesture? What do you think?
So are you talking about the forms of expression or the idea?
Yeah, both forms and meanings.
I think
it would be a good testing ground to compare how the verbal structure and the gestural structure are same or different in that respect.
Because I mean, it's clear that the grammatical forms are much more clearly expressing certain aspectual categories than the gestural forms are. And that's also what we found in the project, that it was then much harder to pin down. You had much broader kinds of distinctions, and it also depended on which language you were looking at. So French was different, quite a bit different than Russian in that regard, for example. So then in Russian, the lexical semantics played a much greater role in terms of correlating with the gesture use. So in that sense, I think we again see the pattern that the gestures are more dependent on the lexicogrammatical forms than vice versa. But that you might see some more schematic characterizations of thinking of manners of action, for example, in gesture use. I mean, like this cyclic kind of gesture having to do with some kind of continuation or something like that can be used in many different contexts. It's just specific to an aspectual kind of distinction. So I think it's no surprise there in the sense that the lexicogrammatical forms are much more codified, entrenched, systematized for expressing aspectual forms than gestures are.
All right. Any other questions? Any other comments? Any suggestions?
If not, I have a question for Andrei and also Olga Fyodorov and others who are involved in the project about the channel, the idea of the communicative channels. And if you could say a few words about that in terms of how you think about that in terms of relations of, let's say, dividing up the problem and thinking of channels as opposed to semiotic systems or modes or something like that. If you had any thoughts on that. It provides a different kind of solution to how to look at this. And I wondered how that relates to, let's say, semiotic systems.
Well, you showed that scheme from our studies that basically summarizes it. So the reason why we introduced channels is because the notion of multimodality is somewhat overstated, because there are just two modalities are being currently studied most of the time. So we decided to introduce this notion of channel as channels as belonging to modalities, and there is a really multiplicity of those. We only posited in that picture. We only posited two channels in the auditory modality, where while in fact we realize that prosody is more than one thing. It's really a very complex system of different sub-channels, including intonation and tempo and intensity and different kinds of timbres and so forth. But just for the sake of simplification, we didn't divide that. And while there are apparently different organs, obvious organs, as compared to what is inside our mouth, we see the organs involved in visual activity. Hands are separate from parts of the face and from other limbs and from the eyes and so forth. But basically, we just wanted to express the idea of multiplicity, but in a more fair way. That's about it. Maybe Olga has something to add to that.
Не-не-не, мне особенно нечего добавить, спасибо.
Yulia Nikolaeva has a question. I see her little blue hand. Yulia?
Thank you. I'll ask my question in Russian, if you don't mind. Check if I understand it right. Thank you. Спасибо еще раз за интересную лекцию. Я записала, чтобы еще перечитать многое. Если я правильно поняла, вы предлагаете фокальные категории, категории внимания и много очень градуальных оттенков того, на что может быть направлено внимание и как можно разделять категории. Мне показалось, что этот подход в такой многоплановой, да, манере будет сложно реализовать в каком-то одном отдельно взятом исследовании. Да? То есть будет взят какой-то один слой из этого фокального, многопланового, учитывается намерение говорящего, слушающего, внимание, категория, дискретность, континуальность и так далее. То есть вопрос вот что. Насколько комплексно может быть и за счет чего может быть реализована вот эта вот вся многосторонняя структура? Спасибо.
Okay, so I think I'll answer in English. I agree that it's going to be a complicated mess to then try to use this, apply this in a detailed analysis or something. But I think that maybe using parts of it, it can be helpful if we can use parts of it in some way to see some overlap or difference in emphasis. For example, changing the focus of the scope of relevant behaviors in different contexts, how we see that moving. Maybe it's more useful as a way to talk about general processes than it is as something to be applied in an Elon kind of, detailed analysis of, especially on a larger scale, where if you have a large amount of data, it's already a huge project to try to work with speech and intonation and gesture and all of that in one Elon file. But I think, I see it especially on a bigger scale in terms of talking with Aliyah Morgenstern, for example, about child language development and the changes that take place in terms of what children pay attention to and what they focus on, and starting out with a quite broad scope of behaviors are taking into consideration and also producing in terms of whole body movements and the great activity of small children that then, especially through education, gets reduced and restrained, constrained into verbal production of language, so that then we see a change in the kind of scope of relevant behaviors that are being considered socially acceptable, let's say, in different contexts. So I think it provides a way to talk about bigger phenomena. In terms of practical details of applying it, that's something that I think we don't have the tools yet to work with that very well. I know also thinking in terms of just how to illustrate this, I think animations would provide a more adequate way to represent some of these ideas, dynamic animations, to then see for a given individual in terms of what they're doing, let's say how their scope of behaviors changes moment by moment, or also for what someone's attending to, how that might expand or contract in different ways. I think we don't have good tools yet, let's say computational tools or visualization tools yet to really work with that. So I think it's something for the future.
Yes, please, more questions.
Yeah.
Vera Polesky.
Irina Mikhailovna.
Maybe what would...
Вера?
По-моему, Ирина Михайловна сначала была.
Ирина Михайловна была первая?
Да, мне кажется, да, но все равно.
Ирина Михайловна, пожалуйста.
Yes, I would like to ask Ellen, whom I'm very pleased to see. Can you briefly illustrate your theoretical paradigm, applying it to metaphor? How do we focally understand metaphors, for example? What role focus of attention plays in metaphor?
So if we take a given instance of usage of some kind of metaphor, someone might use a verbal metaphor and then elaborate on it with a gestural form. If someone doesn't quite understand what the person's saying, for example, then they might reiterate that and then start using a broader scope of behaviors in order to express that. So that, especially if it's an uncommon or unusual metaphor. With the whole COVID situation, when at the beginning, when all of the experts were talking about the curve, and they were talking about the changes and the over and over again, we saw people on TV doing this, and it was going this way, and it was going that way, and nothing is curving. It's a mathematical formula, but we illustrate it with the linear representation. But especially because it was a new idea, that over and over again, people were tracing it. People were, showing different ways, coming back to this, illustrating that, and sometimes not even using the words about curve or change or virus, but they would talk about things might get worse. So better or worse. And so going up is more infection, that's worse. So they would come back to the idea and revisit it using the same kind of visualization technique. So it's similar to how you might have an illustration on a board, on the blackboard or something, where you then write something to illustrate a point. And then you might come back to it and point to it later, or dwell on it and be looking at it and look back at the audience, and then your visual attention explicitly going to it in some ways. So this is something that you see much, that with the curve, you see that much less now, or at least I've seen it much less in the news. When experts talk about the curve, they're not even saying so much flatten the curve. Flatten the curve was this phrase over and over again at the beginning. And now I haven't heard them saying that so much. They're using other terms. So we don't see this, it would be kind of silly or redundant now if someone, one of the experts mentioned that we have to, there's a rise in the number of infection, it seems like we know that. Why are they being so overly emphatic? It would seem like too much. So when it was new information, there was more of this elaboration and use of multiple cues, the verbal, the visual, as opposed to when it became more standard.
Thank you.
Да, Вера, теперь, наверное, ваш вопрос, да?
Да, если можно. Would you consider the possibility that some of your subsystems or semiotic subsystems are connected closer or more tightly than other ones? For example, there are some rules that operate across your subsystems. Like in Russian, we have rules that govern the placement of accents, and they depend on the syntactic structure and not only on information or communicative. You understand?
Yes.
Sorry.
Yes.
Communicative structure. For example, would that mean that prosody is connected more with the verbal subsystem than with gestural or something like that?
So I think by default, as Andrei was talking about, the complexity of sound production, that there, the speech, the lexical or grammatical forms that are spoken and the intonation are inherently more tied to each other. That's a good point. Than the grammar and gesture, for example. So we have a number of people have been trying to research or trying to find connections between grammatical forms and gesture. And this project that we had before on aspect and gesture showed some connections, but it's not a sign language. You know, in the sign language, you really have forms, visual forms that are expressing grammatical notions. But in gesture with speech, we see that in much more limited ways. And the gesture use is going much more with information structure, let's say, highlighting new information, maybe with reference to certain ideas, maybe showing certain pragmatic notions. So I think definitely there's certain, speech and the gesture, speech and the intonation, let's say lexical grammar and intonation are much more closely tied than either of them is with gesture. That having been said though, there is certain research showing the, let's say, mechanical co-production of effort involved in producing louder sounds or producing wider variation of pitch with gesture use.
With gestures,
And so also some research actually by Mark Sverts and some others in Tilburg in the Netherlands, giving people different audio recordings where one speaker was gesturing a lot and, you know, just by naturally by how they were talking, and another speaker talking about the same subject and gesturing very little. And speakers could pick out the gesturing speaker. They could tell who was speaking, who was gesturing a lot when speaking, because they could hear the gestures. They could hear especially the emphasis, the beats that were produced differently when someone was physically moving more than when they were more still when they were talking. So that in some ways there is this connection of gesture and prosodic factors.
And on the other side, we can definitely say that some sequences of gestures are aligned rather with the sequences of intonation phrases than with the sequence of syntactic groups.
Yeah. Yeah. So another example, right?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Yeah, it looks like we're out of questions. So on behalf of the department, I'd like to thank our...
Простите, пожалуйста.
Oh, yeah,
Я вижу сейчас...
sorry. It was a bit too early. I see a little blue hand by Alexei Zverev.
Thank you. Yes, I've got one question about your approach applied to written non-face-to-face communication. So what kind of multimodality can be observed there? What kind of channels, how would you see the channels interacting?
Yeah, so that's a good question. And I think it's also a big difference between whether we are typing something on the computer or on the phone versus when we are handwriting something. So with handwriting, you see a lot of variation and also possibilities for some people even being able to judge the mood of the person who was writing this by their handwriting and the style in which they wrote it. So with there's a lot more variation for size, for example, of the writing itself or spacing or things like that, as opposed to with typing on a keyboard. However, we also obviously have the emojis, emoticons, all of these things that are coming into play that are then adding different layers of communication, but also even ways in which one types their message can vary, whether you're spreading out a word to show exaggeration or something, or highlighting it in some way, as opposed to shortening certain conventional words where they're then more in the background because that's not the new information. So I think it plays out in some different ways, but you can see, I think, some of the same properties coming through.
Okay, thank you. And so would you consider punctuation as a single channel separate from the verbal channel?
I think then punctuation does in many ways constitute its own semiotic system of how it's what it's expressing, how it's expressing things that then clearly overlaps to a large degree with the written language forms. So that these are then two systems that are tightly coupled in many ways, but they do seem to be, they're functioning differently. They're expressing some different ideas. So in that sense, they would be separate.
That's it. No, thank you. Thank you.
Okay, so
if I can just throw out one question on a totally different topic, since I have you all here, a colleague of mine is doing a research project on immigrants to different countries as opposed to people who were born in a certain country. And she's dealing with the concept of who is indigenous or native to the country. And she's looking at how this is expressed in different ways. In looking at this, she found certain works in Russian that were referring to, and they used the phrase "syny zemli," not synovya, but syny zemli. And it wasn't Ukrainian, either it was Russian. And she asked me about this, and I said, I have to ask a native speaker. So if anyone has association, if you want to email me, or if you have associations with or stories about this or know any more about this, she found there was a book that was published, I think in early 1900s about Syny Zemli Vladimirsky, for example, and it was about these different gentlemen who had gone off to different wars, and so they were, the sons of the land. And but she found it in some other context in a more modern website that was also talking about the soldiers, and they called them Syny Zemli.
Syny with a
Syny. Okay.
Yeah, I think it has overtones of some archaism, I guess.
Exactly.
Yeah. Something. Synovia is like a colloquial plural entrenched in the modern Russian morphology, but Syny maybe it's Church Slavonic or something.
So it's just going back.
Sounds
Not
archaic,
exactly,
and
because in their Church Slavonic they had a slightly different form, but it imitates something old and something solemn. It's solemn, yeah.
Yeah, and something bookish, I would say.
a bit archaic and poetic.
So it's not quoting any particular source. It's just in general evokes this sort of sense of.
Yeah, it's a preserved archaic form.
Yeah. Okay. I'll tell her.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if it could be a hidden quotation from, I don't know, Slova Polku Igorya or something like that. I'm not sure, but it must be checked. Yeah.
Okay.
Definitely, we don't feel that in the common use.
So it's more this bookish.
We're not connecting with a particular source when used.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, thank you. So it's my pleasure to express our deeply felt gratitude to Alan for this exciting talk. Thank you so much, Alan. Thank you for coming. We appreciate that a lot. It was a great pleasure to have you here.
Thank you very much, Alan.
Thank you, and thank you to Zoom for making all of these long distance talks possible.
Дорогие коллеги, на этом, собственно, заканчивается осенняя серия наших коллоквиумов. Мы возобновим эту деятельность весной. Скорее всего, можно ожидать, что в том же режиме, что и сейчас, то есть посредством Zoom. Следите, пожалуйста, за нашими объявлениями. Спасибо большое и до встречи.